Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here today, tonight, here in the States, to speak with you about a topic that's quite dear to me, and that is the benefits of engaging formers in the CVE work that we do, especially in peer counseling. And so today I'm going to address two questions. First, the direct question in the broad sense of what are the benefits of engaging formers in peer counseling and other forms of CVE work? And then second, how does this pertain to Indonesia? Now, I'm looking very forward to the conversation that we have after and the Q&A that we have after. And I hope we can get into a good conversation about this subject because it's important. Well, to the first question, what are the benefits of engaging peer formers in peer counseling and other forms of CVE work? By formers, we mean former members of extremist groups who have disengaged, who have reintegrated back into society, and who have, to varying degrees, de-radicalized on certain measures. De-radicalization is quite subjective, and so one is going to de-radicalize on some measures before others. Now, the reason that I would say that it is very advantageous to engage formers in CVE work, particularly in peer counseling, is that formers often have more credibility than mainstream actors, with individuals who may be considering disengaging due to their lived experiences in the extremist community. Formers know what arguments to make, what signals to convey, how to speak the language, the lingo, and what buttons to push. Now, this is going to be especially true in those cases where leaving the group doesn't necessitate leaving the broader community on the whole, and where one is not wholly ostracized for leaving. In these instances, formers may be able to build rapport and trust faster than someone from the outside, who may be viewed with suspicion or may stumble over their own biases and assumptions. Formers are better able to identify at what juncture to begin the conversations on ideology, how to frame those conversations, and what arguments will resonate. They know what topics to start with and what topics to avoid, where a person is more likely to show some flexibility and what topics may cause someone to shut down. For example, individuals may be much more willing to discuss practical subjects, like the conditions under which violence is permissible, than to have deep ideological conversations regarding personal beliefs on religion or race or guns. Speaking more broadly, programs constructed by formers or in consultation with formers tend to be holistic interventions that combine rapport building, economic interventions, professional development, and life skills training and counseling, and eventually, if needed, religious study sessions and ideological conversations. These programs are more likely to help not only the targets of the programmatic interventions, but also wives and families, wives and children in families that standard programs devoid of formers often do not. And they tend to build community in a way that standard programs often do not. Now, how does this pertain to Indonesia? I would say that while Indonesia's programming, it definitely has had its flaws. It's had serious flaws, ad hoc programs, programs that have been mistargeted. On the use of formers in disengagement de-radicalization initiatives, it was one of the pioneers. And so we should pay attention to that. Indonesia has a 20-year history of active participation by formers in disengagement and de-radicalization initiatives. In the Indonesian perspective, it's believed that formers have the greatest potential to convince members of groups they once participated in to revise previously held views on the use of violence and terrorism. They have credibility from their acknowledged Islamic knowledge, often from their jihad experiences, from their lived experiences, and they understand the militants because they were once a part of the community, and they will therefore be accepted in a way that outsiders cannot and will not. Formers have played a role in defining Indonesia's best government-sponsored de-radicalization initiative, the very ad hoc, underfunded soft approach, which aimed to convince militants to reject bombings and get them to cooperate with authorities. This is why the soft approach was never as good a de-radicalization program as it could have been, because the goal was cooperation. But it did move the goalposts in getting them to reject bombings and consider issues of target, timing, location, and condition of attacks. And the linchpins of this program were two formers. Nasser Abbas, the former commander of Jemaah Islamiyah's training region and veteran of the Afghan and Mindanao jihads, and Ali Imran, an Islamic scholar and veteran of jihads in Afghanistan and Ambon, and participant in the 2002 Bali bombing. Abbas would visit terrorists in prison and have conversations with them about why bombings were wrong and the difference between terrorism and jihad. Now, Ali Imran's physical reach was confined to the prison in which he lived. Nasser Abbas did not participate in terrorism. He was released after 2 years, so he was able to go all over the country. Ali Imran serving a life sentence for his role in the first Bali bombing, and so his work is confined to the prison in which he resides, Polda Metro Jaya. But arguably, his influence even there is more widely felt, because in contrast to Abbas, Imran took a more nuanced approach. He refused to condemn the terrorists' interpretation of jihad, and instead he criticized their strategy. He argued they acted precipitously without assessing whether they had popular support or the strength to take on the state, whether the Muslim community would benefit from their actions, or whether they could achieve their goals through religious outreach. And this more nuanced approach not only appealed to key JI members who were already thinking in that way, but also shaped the overall anti-bombing narrative within Jemaah Islamiyah. A second point, formers can be highly impactful in leveraging their influences outside of programmatic interventions to intervene in institutions that teach, promote, and spread extremism. For example, in 2008, Ali Imran and his half-brother Ali Fawzi convinced the faculty at their family's Islamic boarding school, Al-Islam, one of the most notorious JI-affiliated boarding schools, to revise how they taught jihad. The result of these conversations was that Al-Islam stopped teaching weapons, urban warfare, and poisons, and confined their discussion of jihad to theory and its practical application to physical fitness. Third, programs constructed by formers or in consultation with formers tend to be more holistic interventions, combining rapport building, economic interventions, and religious study sessions. For example, Ali Fawzi, former trainer with Jemaah Islamiyah and Mujahideen Kompak, and veterans of jihads in Mindanao, Ambon, and Poso, created a mutual aid society in his hometown of Lamongan to help veterans of Afghanistan, Ambon, Poso, and Mindanao. And their activities included goat breeding, giving small loans to members facing catch shortages, and holding informal religious study sessions where they could re-examine previously held beliefs. When ISIS emerged, the Mutual Aid Society reached out to families of ISIS detainees in Lamongan and offered their children subsidized education at Al-Islam, and invited their wives to join the goat breeding cooperative, and facilitated discussions where families of detainees could express their views without fear, without concerns about repercussions. It empowered the wives economically, and this enabled them and empowered them to be more assertive in expressing their views. It's expressing their opposition to ISIS, and that had a discernible impact. So in short, the Indonesian experience shows the benefit of working with formers on disengagement and de-radicalization. Reasons: they have more credibility than the mainstream actors due to their lived experiences in the group. They know the arguments to make. the buttons to push, and the signals to convey. When they lead conversations around de-radicalization with other militants, they know how to frame the conversation. What arguments will resonate and what arguments will not. When formers design programmatic interventions, they are likely to take a more holistic approach that not only involves the individual, but also their family, and not only targets their religious views, but also their economic needs. And finally, formers also contribute to disengagement and de-radicalization in their ability to intervene informally in institutions that promote extremism to de-escalate their activities. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Julie. We're sort of eager for more from you, but we'll come back to you in the Q&A shortly. So thank you for being so clear and succinct, but we're going to come back and ask you some questions. Okay, we now have a double act from the team at Monash Gender, Peace and Security, from Alex Phelan, who has been Deputy Director at GPS for some years now, and Irine Gayatri, who is doing her PhD at Monash GPS. Irine's worked on Indonesia's national security plan, so they're going to be speaking to us about gender, COVID, the last few years of COVID-19, and PCBE strategies in the ASEAN region and implications for the Women, Peace and Security agenda.
Amazing. Thanks, Greg. And thank you again for the opportunity to present. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about a project that I led on behalf of the team at GPS that was partnered with both UN Women and also Indonesia's BNPT with donor funding from Korea and Canada. We essentially were looking at the impact of COVID through the ASEAN region, paying particular attention, though, to the ways in which misogyny and hostile beliefs towards women were actually fueling or not violent extremism throughout the region. So we know that COVID has been leveraged by violent extremist groups globally to spread and proliferate misinformation and disinformation, and to capitalise off stay-at-home orders by increasing efforts in the online space to radicalise and recruit through social media. In ASEAN, regrettably, such efforts espoused online have also been used to justify and legitimise hostile views and violence against women. ASEAN member states are increasingly recognising the need to integrate gender perspectives into frameworks, into statements and implementation plans to combat terrorism and violent extremism. As some examples, this includes the ASEAN Manila Declaration to counter the rise of radicalisation and extremism, the joint statement on promoting women, peace and security in ASEAN, and the ASEAN Bali Work Plan between 2019 and 2025. Although this has really clear implications for the Women, Peace and Security agenda, or the WPS agenda, PCVE programs throughout the region still lag, regrettably, in responding to not only the integration of gender, but how COVID has also impacted on violent extremism generally in distinct ways. The assumption within existing literature is that usually WPS is co-opted by PCVE in service of a counter-terrorism agenda, which in turn, according to literature, tends to put at risk women's human rights and also women's human rights defenders themselves at risk. Yet arguably, at least for our project in this particular paper that we are writing as a result of it, PCVE plans connected to WPS can actually provide an entry point to a participatory process that responds to women's insecurity. So using Indonesia as an example, we argue that whilst the formulation of national action plans, PCVE, can be highly institutionalised, they're not necessarily rigid, and it can in fact be a participatory process to respond to the unique consequences at the nexus between COVID, the online space, and heightened insecurities for women. Our study has demonstrated that the broadening of PCVE ownership can serve as a shared agenda between government and the grassroots level. It can, in fact, contribute to meaningful participation which then in turn plays a key role in enhancing the success of PCVE strategies and tailoring PCVE policies. So our project findings can be found online. It was called the Gender Analysis of Violent Extremism and the Impact of COVID-19 on Peace and Security in ASEAN, evidence-based research for policy. You can find it on Monash GPS website, the UN Women website, BNPT's K-Hub, and other places, yes?
Bilingual.
Yes, indeed. And this report examined the changing dynamics of violent extremism in the context of COVID, but paying particular attention to the online-offline nexus. Specifically, again, we examined the way in which misogyny and hostile views espoused online were fueling violent extremism throughout the Southeast Asian region, with a specific focus on Indonesia, the Philippines, and southern Thailand, and the degrees to which these insecurities manifested in the offline space. So employing a mixed methods approach through survey dissemination and expert interviews throughout the entire ASEAN region, with the exception of Myanmar, I will preface by saying this, we found that not only had extremist actors strategically ramped up their online messaging during COVID to further mobilise, strengthen their organisations and intensify their violent campaigns, both online and offline, some actors were also using propaganda disseminated through social media and online messaging to specifically espouse misogynistic and hostile views towards women. During COVID, multiple participants expressed their concerns both about the effects of stay-at-home orders and also, of course, the increased reliance on the online space, but also the spread of misinformation and disinformation, including towards women. 70% of survey respondents agreed that online radicalisation and the proliferation of extremist propaganda had actually increased throughout the ASEAN region, and 80% of respondents agreed that COVID had resulted in significant insecurities for women affected by violent extremism. Concerningly, 67% of expert respondents acknowledged that they had seen this kind of content sometimes, often, or very often. And 65% of experts stated that they had personally observed social media content inciting violence towards women and girls. So, for example, a participant from the Philippines stated that, direct quote, Facebook has proven to be an effective tool, especially in today's world where Facebook is the internet for most people. I always see misogynistic and sexist remarks towards women, especially from friends who label themselves as religious and strict followers of Islam. Harassment also fills the comment section of these so-called friends, particularly on women's ability to lead. The majority of those Orthodox Muslim individuals generally agree that women are not entitled to hold the leadership or the topmost public office, whether that be in a nation or a university setting. In fact, it was interesting because multiple participants brought up the critique of women in leadership positions. We saw this quite a lot in the data, with another respondent from the Philippines stated that they had seen jihad being justified based on gender dynamics, observing specifically a Facebook post saying that the Mawari siege happened because the previous governor was a woman, so the city was cursed by God. Other participants brought up how narratives espoused online created insecurities for women in the offline space. So, for example, an individual from Indonesia expressed their concern about pro-polygamy campaigns being espoused online, stating, direct quote, "The polygamy campaign on social media is also quite influential in regard to social trends amongst Hijra groups. Pro-polygamy narratives are usually discussed in line with narratives of gender conservatism, such as the role of women being only in the domestic sphere, the control of women's bodies, and religious narratives that are used to dehumanize women." Multiple participants in the survey also noted that much of the hostile sexism and misogynistic views that they had observed were regarding women's roles in society and also attempts to control women, particularly in the way that women dress and behave. So a participant from Indonesia, for example, observed an extremist group online that heavily criticised how women dress up and how they should abide by what the husband deems is right for them through pictures and accompanying statements. Although such misogynistic views overwhelmingly came from men, there were also cases of women espousing misogynistic attitudes towards women. This is the second project that we've found this trend, actually. Of course, it's quite small in comparison, but it does occur. So, for example, an interview from Indonesia recounted that I recall a moment with the promotion of the draft of law of eradicating sexual violence, which regularly becomes the trending topic. It immediately raises harsh criticisms, predominantly from Islamic radical groups, arguing that the law is a product of Western feminism and will liberate women tremendously. Regrettably, a Muslim woman lecturer delivered her criticism by Instagram and Facebook by inviting the public to deactivate the process of legalising the draft. She falsified the draft as if it was in support of free sex, legal abortion, and legal prostitution. Eventually, the post was withdrawn on these platforms and deemed a hoax by the Ministry of Communication and Information. So despite commitments by ASEAN states to further address the nexus between gender and violent extremism, participants expressed that work really still needed to be done, especially in dealing with the online-offline nexus, and that it specifically exacerbated insecurities for women. We feel that our findings not only have implications for ASEAN member states, but also the broader WPS agenda as part of regional and global consequence for peace and security. So women throughout the region are actively participating online in extremist activities. We know this now. Misogynistic activities and behaviour in offline environments is also occurring, but especially during the pandemic and in light of these stay-at-home orders, our survey interviews mentioned again, I feel like it's the second time I'm talking about it, but this importance also of men-only and women-only forums on social media platforms in radicalising individuals online. I can't stress the importance of these forums enough. By examining these spaces, a greater understanding can emerge of the really gender-specific push and pull factors we've been speaking about all symposium, and the ones that are specifically being used towards women and men to justify and legitimised extremist activity, as well as the repercussions for this in the offline space. Often these gender dynamics are in fact reinforced by extremist groups, potentially presenting a dual challenge for policymakers where women can actually be targeted as victims, but also be agents of violence themselves. So we've been talking about these dichotomies of women as victims and women as perpetrators, but in reality, you can indeed be both. And this is really important because it has implications for effective PCVE strategy and programming. So we found from this project that gender sensitivity and gender responsivity is really quite integral in mitigating the social and economic impacts caused by the pandemic, including insecurities experienced by women affected by violent extremism in violent extremist affected communities, and the heightened participation of women in violent extremism, both in the online and offline space. As in the case of Indonesia, which Irine is going to talk about in a second, a very interesting case study actually, policymakers must really consider the degree to which women are actively or passively influencing their families and broader communities, including within the online space with extremist ideas. Our research demonstrated that both women and men are playing key roles in attempting to counter such narratives and activities at the community level. So this is positive. We're seeing pushback against these misogynistic narratives at the local level. And that gender responsive approaches to violent extremism prevention benefits from really enhancing and ensuring the participation of grassroots CSOs. So linking back to the project that, Greg and Anthony are working on. Capitalising on such work, interestingly, the Indonesian case demonstrates government acknowledgement that PCVE implementation initiatives at the local level in turn develops greater coordination between national and local agencies, and this can in turn allow for the broadening of PCVE as quite a shared agenda, especially when violent extremist affected communities can participate actively in the substantive conversations of the draft. This is really important. So I think I'll turn to Irine now, who is the expert in this area, to present on what we can learn from the Indonesian case.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, colleagues. Pak Greg, we meet again, and thank you, Alex. So yeah, our study in about Indonesia. Can you show the next slide? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. So case study of Indonesia. What can we learn? I heard in the previous session somebody asked to Pak Greg, what can we learn from this? So this is precisely what I'm going to share with you all. What can we learn from Indonesia? Before everything, I would like also to extend my gratitude to GPS Monash University, UN Women, and also right now Deakin University that make this conversation possible. And I also would like to extend my gratitude toward all of our informants during the process of this executive summary of our study, which you can download. Because without their active participation during COVID, we would probably not arriving in this discussion. So what Indonesia can share in this respect? Our study presents lessons learned for other ASEAN countries in moving towards greater gender responsiveness in PCVE policy strategy. So this goes without saying, because the last anti-terrorism policy amended in 2018 did not provide enough room for women to discuss in the formulation process. Of course, there was several of women representatives in terms of the discussion with the women parliament, but when the threat increasingly recruit women, children, family unit, women organization, woman-led organization demand, not only ask or request, but demanded that the government consider that perspective when formulation the PCVE National Action Plan. So that went in 2018 after the Surabaya bombing. So we said Surabaya bombing was an eye-opener for the furtherance of discussion between the government with this in this regard BNPT or the National Counterterrorism Agency that opened the gate widely to accommodate and discuss face-to-face with women-led society organization, not only the national NGOs, but also local NGOs. Of course, we also, I think in that range of time, the participation from women-led CSOs in National Action Plan PCVE, we had to perhaps walk back about the discussion of the terminologies which Pak Greg already mentioned, but it was not at one time accepted by civil society organization. We problematize the violent extremism as the catchword, as the phrase. We also discuss it with regard to other, what community sense as threat, intolerance, right? Hate speech, extreme speech, and not only coming from the Islamist jihadists, but also hardline nationalists. We had this spectrum, our head. So we put it in the discussion of terminology, and it was discussed between BNPT and also CSO, women-led CSO. At the same time, responding to the distinct consequences of the nexus between COVID, the online space, and heightened executions of movement, it also became the background of the civil society organization, especially women-led civil society organization, to develop more conversation with the BNPT. So the BNPT formulated the action plan starting in mid-2017 by involving various relevant stakeholders, applying the whole government and whole society approach, not only as mantra, but really work up to the detailed level. I think one of the report by AIPG, phase 2 in 2018 also documented this process because they contributed in the process through the Wahid Foundation, our national partner of Pak Greg project. So the Wahid Foundation, for instance, led by the daughter of former Indonesian government, Abdurrahman Wahid, representing moderate Islam. Moderate Islam, I can tell, is that one paradigm taken up by majority of civil society organizations, but also approved by the government as part of the mainstream perspective in detailing or in threading what we said, what we term as counter narratives, right? So counter narrative, according to moderate Islam, is part of the national conversation or national agenda. Of course, there are some groups from for instance, the conservatives who challenge this, but this is the democratic space. So the government, on one hand, formulating the moderate speeches in education curriculum. So we see the translation of our PCVE National Action Plan in the education curriculum, also in local-based program led by women CSO. They adopted this language. What is moderate Islam in terms of counter-narrative? For instance, with regard to polygamy that Alex mentioned. What's it called? Is polygamy halal or mubah, right? Is condemning government as Tawgut, as Hizbut Tahrir mentioned, is mubah, or we should, take it up the other way. So there are several lessons from Indonesia, right? So, solid teamwork between BNPT, and those are several hands, also with civil society organization, in discussing this continuously in every session, from the national to local. By local, please remember we have 37 provinces, 200 something million people, which is, if not if not collaboratively managed, we would create trouble to our closest neighbor, as well as proven in Bali bombing, which we really not want that to happen again. So social development and gender lens in security sector. So this actually, the interaction between women civil society organization with the counterterrorism agency was the first time in our policy history that intersect gender perspective into security response. So although BNPT has two dimensions, counterterrorism, hard traditional approach, but this PCVE represents soft approach where the consideration of women-led civil society organization is taken up into action. And this particular action at the moment is being developed into local action plan of PCVE that facilitates by the government platform, that also supported by several other donor countries in the K-Hub platform. I think I will just stop here, and I will just lead the conversation in the question and answer. Yes,
we're out of time. That
Yes.
sounds fantastic.
Thank you.
No problem.
Very much. You guys finished early, which is excellent. And, well, 35 seconds, but we'll follow it into the Q&A time. And I think we've got Julie back with us. Julie, are you there? We'll move straight on to taking questions. So a show of hands, please. We've got a microphone going around. I think lunch slows down the thinking process with questions. Yeah, people are a bit sleepy, but they should be stimulated. No, Malcolm has a question. So it's not Malcolm, it'll be in the show. So.
The M's rule.
Yeah.
Thanks. My questions for the first presenter around the use of formers, and obviously you've made a really robust case around Indonesia's history of using formers and everything like that too. I had a question around the credibility question, I suppose, because isn't there also a risk that formers might themselves be seen as apostates or and actually lack credibility for people who might be at risk of engaging extremism? And the other part of that question too is, actually coming out of another area of research around research on cults, for instance, there's an expression there, the methodological question around apostate testimony, and that actually the experiences of people who have left a cult or left a movement tend to be a pretty biased view of what life was actually like within their view. It's a little bit like asking a recent divorcee what marriage is like, and just wonder if you had any kind of comments on that.
Great, thanks, Malcolm. Julie's written a couple of books on this, so she has some comments.
Well, one thing that I would say, I'll take your first question first, and I think that's where one of the reasons I didn't front load all of this is I was hoping for some good questions, and I think your question is fantastic. I think you have to be very careful in selecting participants for these programs, and also participants in the disengagement, in the disengagement and peer counseling programs, at what point, so for example, for the participants who are going to be, let's say, a peer counseling program or a peer advisor program on the model of Ali Imran or Nasir Abbas, ideally, what we would want to see, and we can see this in some of the groups like Life After Hate and Parents for Peace in the United States, and who are peer counselors in for people disengaging from white supremacist movements. The organizations that are employing these peer counselors, they need to first assess, are they ready? Well, what does ready look like? What are the markers that we're looking for to determine whether someone is ready, emotionally ready, psychologically ready? Because doing that kind of work, it takes a toll on you. And so to do that kind of work, you have to be emotionally ready. You have to be psychologically ready. You have to know where your limits are and what you were willing to do and what you were not willing to do. And that's not something that a person can just determine independently, but it also needs to be assessed by the organization working with them, number one. Now, then you have to also look at the participants in these programs. So somebody who is in a peer-to-peer counseling program, peer-to-peer mentoring program, or someone who is in a program like Ali Imran Nasir Abbas, if you're doing something that's more of a peer-to-peer counselor, peer-to-peer mentor program, like what Ali Fauci does, he is not dealing with people who are takfiri. He's not dealing with people who are hardline anymore. He's working with people who want to be part of this group. And there needs to be assessments on that too, just practically speaking. Is this person, how do we determine, is this person actually disengaging? Is this person actually interested in reintegration? Or is this person someone who is trying to get a shorter sentence and is playing a role? And there's ways to assess that. But that goes back to rapport building, that goes back to actually having assessments. And that's not something that the Indonesians do as well as they should. One thing that's, I think, fascinating about Indonesia is that the costs of exit are actually quite low. The cost of moving between groups is quite low, but also, so long as you don't make a big deal out of it, you can go inactive. So long as you're not public about it, you can go inactive, live your life. Nobody's going to threaten you. You are not going to be excommunicated from your family. Some of your friends might actually still talk to you. Some of them won't. You'll lose some. But you will retain your family, unlike with Aman Abdurrahman's communities, Jayade, Tawhid wa al-Jihad, where you would have lost access to your family. Where you would have lost access to your community, where there would have been threats against your life. So you have to know what group you're dealing with, because of the low risk of a quiet exit or going inactive, where you have kind of one foot out and you reintegrate and go live your life, but might still retain some friendships. It does afford the opportunity for people to not really worry about being labeled an apostate and then not trusted. And also because of that, I think you can rely on their testimony. Me as a researcher, one way that I've found is anyone I talk to the first time is going to give me a version of the truth. They're going to tell me a heavily redacted version of the truth. But that's why I keep going back to the same people over and over again, because once they get to know you, once they trust you, once they like you, they give you a fuller picture. What I found is people don't lie as much as they obfuscate. They just leave stuff out. And so I think to that second point, how do we rely on the person? Are they a reliable narrator? How will they be viewed? I think it depends on who they're talking to. But so long as they didn't make a grand statement of their departure, they may actually be treated politely and allowed to make their case. And they might actually, not with the hardcore, not with the most doctrinaire, but with the rank and file, they can make a real difference. And the rank and file, making a real difference with the rank and file is important, because the rank and file get radicalized and then they become operatives. And this this enables the rank and file to form a different line. So I hope I answered that question.
You certainly did. That was excellent and comprehensive and clear. Thank you very much. Any other questions for our panel?
Yes.
Great.
My question is for Alexandra and Irine. First of all, thank you for the good presentation. And I'd like to ask you about your participants, especially there's a strong indication and statistics that you come up with. How did you choose your participants? Because this is very strong indication, and mostly it's against religious players, let's say. And the second thing, how can we benefit from this in our context and prevent and counter violent extremism? Thank you.
Thank you. No, I think it's okay. No, thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Irene was just asking if I needed some help with some of the stats, but no, I think we're all good. Thank you, Irene. Just to brief background of the project, we had 6 months to conduct this in. It took 4. I'm sorry, I'm not making excuses, but it took 4 months for the contract to go through. We had 2 months. We had 4 months to carry this out. A month to conduct both the surveys and interviews. A decision was made very early on that we were going to conduct interviews with key informants, so subject matter experts employing the SME approach, and the dissemination of surveys amongst practitioners and experts. Expert practitioners. So specifically, Irine has great networks within Greg's Sean CSO network. This included local grassroots organisations, local women's organisations, civil society organisations, but we've also got connections from the centre in government intelligence into the security apparatus as well. So particularly for the surveys, we conducted quite a broad net across all ASEAN countries, but for the key informant interviews, we specifically directed this towards people that we would know were subject matter experts. So not just religious figures, we also engaged with leaders of CSOs, also women's organisations as well, individuals we knew within Intel or had networks in Intel as well, and also those in government. We conducted some interviews with some ministers, didn't we, Irine? Yeah, in a focus group. So that we did cast a broad net and ensured that we weren't just focusing on individuals that were involved within the religious community. We pride a lot of we put a lot of emphasis on our research to triangulate. Triangulate is very important for us. So we always ensure that we get as many voices as possible. Now, in terms of what we can learn, I think, Irine, would you like to maybe talk about some of the lessons learned in terms of that participatory process for other countries within the ASEAN region, and even how we could potentially think about this in the context of Australia?
Thank you, Alex. And also, very good question, and it's very important. Again, considering we are neighbor. Yeah. So I think one aspect that is, first aspect that needs to be understood is that first, in seeing government and state, there is this particular, I discussed this with Pak Subedi this morning. Sometimes there is this particular perspective that Indonesia is very heavily militarized, a police state, and so on and so forth. But the thing is that after 1998, we changed as a nation, as a state. Civil society organization with its broad spectrum invoked, if not colored our perspective about how to govern in the name of democratization. So this particular process also affect how we respond to the reality of multiculturalism, pluralism, and also the need to develop tolerant and understanding, you can say, what is it called? Together, yes, cohesion, but not in terms of Machiavelli's perspective. So civil society organization has a very much thing, to contribute to the development of this perspective. That actually affect how when the civil society organization and civil state process in formulating of the National Action Plan of PCVE. Discussion about how Indonesia should respond is also reflect this condition. I think for that aspect, where Australia perhaps could also look into, because Australia is also a multicultural country. I think you can also reach me on my email if you want to have further discussion.
Thank you very much. That's a great closing off. And thank you, Julie, for staying up late for us, and look forward to hearing more from you. And
Thank you for having me.
because they're great. Thank you. And thank you, Ellen.